Today, in episode 1 from my transformational program, The Truth About Sex Addiction, we're going to be talking about the 4 key factors to understanding sex addiction. The number of people in the United States currently living with a sex or porn addiction is estimated at between 12 to 30 million. Both men and women can struggle with sex addiction, although there's still limited research that exists on female sex or porn addiction. What that means is approximately 6 to 8% of US adults could be classified as addicted to sex or porn. The percentage of Americans who are addicted has risen from 3% in 1990 to about 6.5% in 2022. That's an estimated number of 21 million Americans. Can you relate to feeling as though you've no control over your sexual situation, or that your compulsive sexual behavior that may involve a normally enjoyable sexual experience has become an obsession, and that it prevents you from forming a normal, healthy relationship, or perhaps is negatively impacting an existing healthy relationship, no matter what you do? What if I told you that there is a way out of being stuck in compulsive sexual behavior, and a way of actually developing or further nurturing a long-term, honest and sexually healthy, loving relationship? Would you believe me? Well, I'm here to tell you that while it may be hard for you to remember what it was like before your life was shackled by sex addiction, if you take small, consistent steps, you'll eventually get to where you're trying to go. So, are you ready to turn your life around? In this YouTube episode on the 4 key factors to understanding sex addiction, we will start to explore those steps to recovery. My name is Dr. Susie LeBrock from amisexaddict.ca. I'm a doctor of clinical sexology and a psychotherapist, and I've been working in the field of addiction and mental health for over 20 years. You can find this episode on YouTube at newlifepsychology.ca/episode 1. We teach people struggling with sex and porn addiction to reclaim their body, their mind, and sexuality using proven tools to heal past their pain and step into their personal power. In this YouTube video today about understanding sex addiction, I've organized 4 key factors in a manner that I hope really supports your understanding. There's a lot of information that I will cover in this video. So I've prepared a single-page handout for you to keep on hand as a bit of a checklist. It's available to download on our website, newlifepsychology.ca/episode 1. So let's dive in to key factor number 1 of understanding sex addiction and or compulsive sexual behavior as an actual diagnosis. So addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. So what does that mean in layman's terms? Well, what that means is a dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically or unhealthily pursuing reward and or relief by substance or behaviors. Similar to that pursuit of reward or relief by drugs or alcohol, sex addiction is the intense focus on sexual fantasies, and the urge or activities that create reward or relief are sexual. So addiction is characterized by an inability to consistently abstain, an impairment in behavioral control, craving, a diminished recognition in the problems, and a dysfunctional emotional response. And like any other chronic disease, addiction involves cycles of relapse and remission. Sexual addiction has no formal diagnosis or classification in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, but it does have a classification of compulsive sexual behaviour in the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD-11, and that is a compulsive sexual behaviour, or CSB, which is really good news. Sexual addiction is probably the most commonly used lay term that you'll hear, but other terms are compulsive sexual behaviour, problematic sexual behaviour, hypersexuality, hypersexuality disorder, sexual compulsivity, or sexual impulsivity. Although sexual addiction involves activities that are very common to a normal sex life, such as masturbation, pornography, phone sex, cyber sex, multiple sex partners, it's when a person's sexual thoughts and activities consume their life despite the negative consequences that they're considered to have a sexual addiction. You'll hear me use the term consequences or adverse consequences or negative consequences as a really big part of addiction. So key factor number 2, is a sexual addiction similar to other addictions? Yes, absolutely. The addiction feeling is what makes it similar. The craving for sex is similar to cravings that are felt for alcohol or drugs for those that have addictions to those substances. It's an overwhelming compulsion or an urge that's so strong the person feels that they have to do it. They return to that behavior over and over despite the negative consequences. Addiction is characterized by a compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite the negative or adverse consequences. The two properties that characterize all addictive stimuli is that they are both positively reinforcing. For instance, it increases the likelihood that the person will repeat the exposure to them, and they are intrinsically rewarding. For instance, they activate the brain's reward pathways and are therefore perceived as being something positive or desirable. The brain registers all pleasure in the same way, whether they originate with a psychoactive drug, a monetary reward, a sexual encounter, or a satisfying meal. In the brain, pleasure has a distinct signature, and that's the release of dopamine. The brain registers all pleasure in the same way, whether they originate with a psychoactive drug, a monetary reward, a sexual encounter, a satisfying meal. In the brain, pleasure has a distinct signature, the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. The dopamine release is so consistently tied with pleasure that neuroscientists refer to the region of the brain as the brain's pleasure center. Addictive drugs and sex provide a shortcut to the brain's reward system by flooding this part of the brain with dopamine. The hippocampus, which is the learning and long-term memory, lays down memories of this rapid sense of satisfaction, and the amygdala, the fear part of the brain, creates a conditioned response to that stimuli. So the brain, when it experiences pleasure, floods itself with dopamine, and then the learning and memory creates a conditioned response. Makes sense, right? Dopamine not only contributes to the experience of pleasure, but also plays a role in learning and memory. And these are two key elements in transitioning from liking something to becoming addicted to it. Dopamine interacts with glutamate, another neurotransmitter, to take over the brain's system of reward-related learning. And this system has an important role in sustaining life because it links activities needed for human survival, such as eating and sex, with pleasure and reward. Interestingly, repeated exposure to an addictive substance or behavior causes nerve cells in the reward center and the prefrontal cortex to communicate in a way that couples liking something with wanting it, in turn driving us to go after it. This process motivates us to take action to seek out the source of pleasure that is necessary to sustain life. So I'll repeat that again. This process motivates us to take action to seek out the source of pleasure that is necessary to sustain life. So you see how the body kind of gets jumbled when it comes to both food and sex, in respect that something that is sustaining life is also highly pleasurable and can become addictive. Don't panic about all of the information that you've heard in this video. I did mention that I've created a PDF that just summarizes these points. It's at newlifepsychology.ca/episode 1, just to help you remember this information. So a reminder, a quick summary of the ABCs of addiction: an inability to abstain, an impairment in behavioral control, a craving or increased hunger, a diminished recognition of the problems, and a dysfunctional emotional response. So key factor number 3, what are the signs and symptoms of sexual addiction? Well, if you think that you or somebody that you know may suffer with sexual addiction, these are some of the things that you can look out for. You or the person that you notice is becoming preoccupied or always craving or thinking about sex. You or your loved one may spend a considerable amount of time on activities related to sex, such as looking for potential partners, visiting pornographic websites, or frequenting venues where this kind of behavior is common. Becoming increasingly secretive about where you're going or what you're doing, becoming angry or defensive when questioned about your behavior, compulsive behavior, such as increasing the frequency or intensity of sexual activities. Sexual behaviors are becoming increasingly extreme. Other responsibilities, family matters, are becoming neglected or completely ignored in the pursuit of sex. Behaviors continue despite negative consequences. Sadly, people will often end up hitting rock bottom before they get help. Feeling irritable when you're unable to engage in sex, a lack of boundaries, and sometimes physical symptoms. For instance, people will come to me with erectile dysfunction, and it's only when we start to break it down we notice that they've been excessively using pornography and they're unable to get an erection with a normal person or normal sexual activities as the result of the dopamine surge through looking at pornography. If you want some more information on the types of problematic sexual behaviors, check out our website, www.amiasexaddict.ca, and get the PDF that's available on the 10 types of problematic sexual behaviors. It's really helpful because it gives you a summary of the types of behaviors that are connected to sex and porn addiction. So key factor number 4, one of the big questions that I get asked: what actually causes sex addiction? So what we know is that addiction is typically an attempt to solve a problem, at least in the beginning. It's a symptom of a much deeper malaise, and in most cases trauma. When bad things happen, or simply when good things that should have happened didn't happen, for instance, when children don't get their needs met or when they're neglected, this can lead to addiction. The most important question that is asked by Dr. Gabor Mate, a phenomenal teacher on trauma and addiction, is not why the addiction, but why the pain. In order to heal addiction, we understand that we first must look at why the underlying trauma. So let's look at the role of trauma in addiction. We know that all addiction has in its roots some kind of trauma, but not all trauma leads to addiction. There is a distinction there. The shame around addiction is the shame of trauma. Society tends to deny and ignore trauma. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACEs study, is one of the most important studies done thus far. And it's shown a profound correlation between ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and addiction. Some of the major ACEs are emotional, physical, sexual abuse in children, domestic violence, household substance abuse, mental illness in the household, parental separation or divorce, criminal household member, emotional or physical neglect. We know that you have to heal the underlying trauma before we can truly heal addiction. When a child cannot fight or flee, the brain will tune out in order to cope with a stressful situation or a stressful environment. Tuning out is a way of coping with overwhelming stress, and that self-soothing behavior will lead to addiction later on. Tuning out can continue to be a problem because it causes a lack of presence and focus in situations which trigger us, and even later on when there's no obvious threat. We tend to get into relationships with people at the same level of trauma as us, and people who have the same level of self-esteem as us. Interestingly, trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us psychologically and physiologically. Let's talk for a minute about the biochemistry of addiction. Our brains have opiate receptors and endogenous opiates that help us cope with pain. These can be triggered even by a placebo. This means that just the thought of pain can trigger the release of our internal painkillers. Addictive substances such as heroin and opium fit perfectly into these receptors. Whatever substance or behavior we are addicted to helps us to get pain relief, love, connection, and joy. That's the opioid system. Of course, we're going to want the substance or the behavior. Who doesn't want to feel that way? Furthermore, the stimulant neurotransmitter dopamine flows in the brain when we seek food or a sexual partner. Furthermore, the stimulant neurotransmitter dopamine flows in the brain when we seek food or a sexual partner. We feel very alive when our brain is flooded by dopamine. If we don't feel we are lovable, the heightened charge of the hunt and the chase floods us with dopamine, which makes us feel good. We get more from the outside the more we need. Addicts are addicted to the feel-good chemicals released by a certain substance or behavior, for example, dopamine or opiates, not by the substance or the behavior itself. Addicts lack stress regulation or impulse control, similar to infants, often due to their brain circuits not developing properly in infancy. Therefore, stress often causes addicts to relapse as it overwhelms them. Just briefly, let's look at the role of social circumstances in addiction. In current society, communities really have broken down, and there is more loneliness, isolation, poor relations between kids and parents, for example. It's no surprise that mental health issues, ADHD, and addiction are increasing with a lack of supportive communities and connection. We need unconditional acceptance and compassionate care for our nervous systems to relax and for us to heal. At New Life Psychology, we want you to have the life that you deserve, a great life and an experience that moves us. Check out the PDF that goes with this video on the 4 key factors to understanding sex addiction. It's downloadable at newlifepsychology.ca/episode 1. Let us know what you think at info@newlifepsychology.ca. My name is Dr. Susie LeBrock at www.amisexaddict.ca.